Truman takes over after the death of FDR, okay, which is this kind of sucks for him because it's it's very shortly into FDR's term. Him and FDR aren't even that close yet, okay? And FDR just flippin' dies, okay? So, anyways, he has a very interesting presidency with a lot of hallmark events. So, he's the one that has to choose to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He sees the start of the Cold War and the implementation of the Marshall Plan to aid European construction and the establishment of the United Nations, and the beginning of the Korean War, and he starts the Truman Doctrine, which is saying we're going to contain communism globally, okay? We're not going to fight it where it already is. I'm not going to go to the Soviet Union and say no more communism for you. I'm not going to go to the new Chinese Communist Party and say no more communism for you. But I'm going to say no more taking communism anywhere where it isn't already, okay? Anyways, he works on civil rights in the Fair Deal, except a lot of them face resistance. He's going through the Red Scare at this point. It really sucks to try and get things done with McCarthyism, if you didn't know. Anyways, he will get more into his presidency in HOA2 with World War II. Anyways, Eisenhower, um, so his presidency is really marked by the Cold War, um, with containment in the Eisenhower Doctrine, which they're trying to. This is specifically in the Middle East, trying to counter Soviet influence. So we see later, much later, like at this point, the Soviet Union is most definitely trying to exert power in the Middle East, right? We see this later with Afghanistan, but this is not in his presidency. But if you need proof that they were trying to do that, they are. Um, he sees the end of the Korean War, interstate highway system, which is very big for his presidency, right? Advancements in civil rights, and we see the integration of schools with the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, which he strongly, he forces state governments to abide by this, right? And does this mean that he's a wonderful person that hates segregation? No, right? His whole thing is the Supreme Court told me I have to, right? I don't want a lawless land without law and order, right? He's not he's not a champion of anti-segregation is one thing you have to keep in mind, okay? He's doing this because the Supreme Court said we have to integrate schools, and they're not doing it, and he respects the country's authority more than anything else, okay? He sees the Suez Crisis, the U-2 incident, nuclear arms race, and he's trying to kind of avoid confrontations with the Soviet Union, okay? Anyways, JFK, we see Cold War diplomacy to the max, right? The world almost blows up with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with Khrushchev, um, and he promotes New Frontier. Um, he aims to advance civil rights. Once again, hard to do in this point in time. Um, and he sees space exploration. By the way, we land the first person on the moon. I don't actually. Do we do it this time? I can't remember. I thought we landed the first person on the moon in '65. Maybe we did. I don't know. I can't remember. Sorry, everybody. Don't say that in an essay. Um, and then we see social welfare programs. Um, Total flop though was the Bay of Pigs invasion. That really was bad. We see more involvement in Vietnam, which Americans really don't like. With the Green Berets, by the way, remember that name, Green Berets. He sends them as advisors, not as troops. But they all, for all intents and purposes, they are troops. Just remember that. Oh yeah, they do the Alliance for Progress in Latin America, but his presidency cut short because he gets assassinated in '63. Sadly, R.I.P. His family's very interesting. You should go look into it. Also, you put the embargo on Cuba at this point. This is what totally cripples Cuba, right? Like a lot of times people will say Cuba's like communism's could have, should have, didn't because of the embargo. Then we can't see what communism could have possibly been in Cuba. I mean, my guess is still not that good because Fidel Castro was kind of a flop. But that's an interesting point to make is that the embargo really crippled them, and he bought like a bunch of Cuban cigars before he didn't. I'm trying to think. I feel like there's one more thing I had to say on this one. Um, yeah. Okay, let's move on. LBJ. So he had the Great Society, right? So the goals of the Great Society. Remember this. Remember this. Remember this. Eliminate poverty and racial equality. Okay? Not eliminate racial equality. He wants racial equality. Sorry, I phrased that weird. But we see initiatives like Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights Act, and Voting Rights Act. Okay? Um, a notable one too was Head Start with um, the programs for preschoolers, low-income preschoolers. But it's really overshadowed by the Vietnam War, which people are very, very, very mad about. Okay, um, people marched outside of his window yelling, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Right? At this point, Vietnam War is not popular at all. Right? He doesn't even run for re-election because he is over it. Right? I mean, having people scream that out your window, that's pretty terrible when you're just carrying on what the guy before you did. Um, but yeah, also memorize the Voting Rights Act of '64 and Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights Act of '65. They are different, very similar in what they do, but also very different in what they do. So remember, um, to differentiate them. And then Nixon's, we see actually some pretty significant foreign policy achievement, right? He reopens relations with China. Um, I know that HOA one students don't have Miss Houndstein, but there's actually a photo on the wall of Nixon meeting with the leader of China in '72. He pursues the top of the Soviet Union through arms control agreements, and he sees the Apollo 11 moon landing, and he also increases environmental protections. But he was a very deeply paranoid man, and we see his second term get overshadowed by the Watergate scandal, where he had them. Well, they broke in to the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and they try to cover it up. Um, and he actually had tapes from it, so it's not known that he sent them to do that, but it's known that he knew that they did that and was trying to cover it up. He refuses to give the tapes over, yada yada yada. It's found out, he knows. He resigns from office after this because this is just too much to come back from. But that really overshadows his presidency, but he did have some pretty notable achievements. And then the Vietnam War, which this is like slotted into here. It doesn't end in LBJ's presidency, but it it ends after Nixon. But I thought it was best to put it here because it's kind of separate from the rest of the presidents. Um, and this is a conflict between communist North Vietnam, who's supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the non-communist South Vietnam, who's backed by the U.S. Important to note, Ho Chi Minh was not always a communist, by the way. You will learn this in HOA 2. Remember this. He originally just wanted, Vietnamese independence for the most part, but he kind of gets totally ignored at the Treaty of Versailles signings, and they don't care what he has to say. And then he turns more radical after this point, right? So, really, it's a Cold War war. This is, like the Korean War, kind of a physical manifestation of Cold War ideologies, right? Um, so the U.S. escalates involvement after Gulf of Tonkin incident, um, but it's not popular in the United States. The United States hates the Vietnam War, right? They think it's a total waste of time, a total waste of young men, right? And the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese are kind of beating the U.S., and they end up beating the U.S., right? Because they're not measuring the war in territory gained like the U.S. is. The U.S. is putting on the screens, oh gosh, we gained this many miles of territory. But the Viet Cong is purposely retreating, right? They're fighting a guerrilla war, right? They know that they're not gonna win by lining their troops up and saying, "Go fight Americans," right? They're purposely ambushing them, booby trapping them, right? They're blending in with the local population, right? It starts to get to soldiers' heads too that you can't tell who is an ally and who isn't, right? You don't know if that boy you saw on the street corner is secretly a member of the Viet Cong or actually a little boy trying to sell you something, right? So, and United States soldiers end up doing some pretty devastating stuff to some Vietnamese villages, right? So it ends the fall of Saigon in '75. Um, so Vietnam's reunified under communist control. Actually, fun fact: Kissinger was given the Nobel Peace Prize for dealing with Vietnam earlier, and the reason that he refused to take it was because the fall of Saigon, he didn't create lasting peace, not the horrific war crimes that he allowed to happen. So that's a fun fact. So yeah, Vietnam, pretty brutal. The United States is not happy with it, and the Viet Cong and guerrilla warfare prove superior in this case. And that's all. Thank you guys for tuning into Toon Talks, and I'm so glad that I could make these videos for y'all. Um, and yeah, this is the last one, I think. So I'll see ya. I hope you guys enjoyed them.